Yo, what is up? What's up, everybody? Welcome to Stonks Maxxing Day 61. So, I'm about to start reading Chip War. This is part 6, and I think last stream I was working on the tech coverage stuff, but gonna pass that off for a little bit because I feel like I'm in the reading mood. Tech coverage, I just have to finish maybe a few closing thoughts, but yeah, I kind of want to pick up where we left off, I think a few weeks ago, maybe last week or 2 weeks ago, on where Stonks, I was about to say Stonks Maxxing, but where we are with Chip War. So I was able to kind of skim through the entire book after the streams, kind of off camera, and I don't remember fully everything, but as we get on towards the later chapters, it starts developing some interesting concepts for the relationships between China and the US, how the geopolitical landscape looks today, especially in the context of semiconductors. And I kind of want to start there for today. So I believe this is part 8, which is the final part of the book, and it's called The Chip Choke. Let me see. Yeah. Okay, so it is the chip choke. I'm gonna add a little bookmark here. Okay, so let's kind of see where we are. We have the first few chapters, 1, 2, okay, from steel to silicon, the switch, and chapter 3, okay, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, part 1, okay, Cold War chips. So I think part 1 talks a little bit about how all of this semiconductor integrated circuit industry came to be, and this really starts off in the Silicon Valley area in San Francisco. Usually is the wrong word here, but that was mainly funded by the US government to research a lot of new technologies to help the military defeat, in a sense, the Russians in the Cold War. So it turns out that it wasn't going to be the biggest bomb or the most amount of tanks that was going to win a war in the late 20th century. It was going to be how well you could precisely aim a missile to some type of target, and the precision of that missile, and maybe even some of the technical surveillance capabilities that a company or a country might have. Those are really the big things that are winning a war in the late 20th century, early 21st century. So that's kind of the big idea in part 1. So we're introduced to William Shockley. He was kind of the founder of the bipolar junction transistor. And so this transistor was really the foundation for a lot of these integrated circuits that were produced, I think, from 1950s all the way up until the 1980s. And we're then introduced to Robert Noyce, Jack Kilby, and they're both pioneers in the integrated circuits game. Oh, man. Oh, okay. Bless. So, integrated circuits, these are access memory. These are all considered to be integrated circuits. You have a bunch of transistors, maybe some capacitors, even some other stuff that belongs in a circuit, and all of that is stuck onto a single. Alright, I think the YouTube is now responding. Okay, I think I just have to wait a little bit for maybe the bandwidth to improve. Not entirely sure. But I was talking about integrated circuits. So everything today that you think of, CPU, GPU, dynamic random access memory, they're all integrated circuits. They're a complex circuit on a single chip, and you shrink that chip down. You shrink all the transistors on that chip to get kind of this idea of Moore's law on how you can improve the compute, the ability of your, excuse me. Oh man, that sneeze fucked me up. But yeah, you can shrink down the chip so that you can fit more transistors on a single chip, increase the processing power of your chip exponentially. Right, okay, I think I might have misspoke there. I think it's shrinking the amount of transistors on your chip. So you're not shrinking the chip itself, you're shrinking the transistors. And so the more transistors you have, the more computations you can do in a single second or something. I think that's the idea of Moore's law. You can shrink the transistors, and that allows you to increase the processing power exponentially for any integrated circuit. So let's double check that. Okay, yeah. It's a guy that invents photolithography, so I totally forgot about that. But that's the idea of printing with light, pretty much. And I think today ASML is the bigger company, almost, I think the only company that really produces industry-leading, technology-defying photolithography equipment for semiconductor manufacturers. Yeah. So reading the dependence. Okay, so this is the idea where people start to see the value of integrated circuits beyond the industry use, so the military use, and so they're trying to break into kind of this mass consumer market where you have different electronic devices that are being made targeted towards the consumers of everyday Americans. Things like the Sony Walkman, which I think doesn't get introduced until maybe the later chapters, the later parts on Japan. But I think of maybe microwaves or cars, maybe even refrigerators at the time, toaster ovens. So all of these electronic equipment devices all need different types of transistors, integrated circuits, to be able to process information and control different parts of the device. And that's probably it. I'm not entirely sure how a fridge works or how a vacuum works, but I'd say it's pretty good. Okay, so now we fast forward about, so that's around 1950s, 1960s. So now it's 60 years later, 70 years later, in 2020. So yeah, that's rough. Okay. Oh, actually, it seems like this is around 2015. Let's start here with part 8. So we'll call this the chip choke. Chapter 49. Everything we're competing on. Okay, I'm gonna just start here. Let's see how far we can get. I'm gonna take some notes and let's do this. So actually one question I do have, so this is mention of what is an industry trade group? So Okay, so this is an association that is funded by companies in the industry that it represents. So that's what an industry trade group is. And the Semiconductor Industry Association is a US-based industry trade group for the semiconductor industry. Okay. Okay, so this is something that is interesting, right? The topic, or I guess the chapter starts off with Brian Kurzanek, I think that's his name. That's how you pronounce it. So he is the president of the Semiconductor Industry Association, or he's the chairman of it in 2015. And he pretty much is saying at this time he wants to lobby the US government to do something about China's. Yeah. Yeah. So China's massive semiconductor subsidies. And I remember, I think this is part of the China Semiconductor Industry Fund. I'm not entirely sure what the full name is, but I remember this is part of Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 plan. And so his goal was to kind of subsidize, almost nationalize the Chinese semiconductor industry by creating an investment fund that would be sponsored by multiple Chinese state companies or state banks, state agencies, and that would kind of bolster the domestic semiconductor industry. So I think the biggest player today is Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. So that's the SMIC company. And I think that right now they're actually blacklisted by the US in terms of the ability to get leading edge products from US based companies like NVIDIA, Intel, even ASML, I think, is also part of that blacklist, meaning that they can't buy the leading lithography products from ASML. So going back to this idea in 2014, so that happened, and now I believe the US was facing some pressure. The US being the US companies, so that's going to be the Intels, the NVIDIAs, what else was big at the time? The AMDs at the time, even Micron Technologies, were facing some pressure from these Chinese companies, and even maybe some litigation on patent protection was also a pretty big problem at the time. I could be wrong, so I'm gonna keep reading this a little bit. Okay, so Industry Trade Group is an association that is funded by companies in the industry that it represents. Okay, so I kind of want to see what that was, because I remember I wrote this, right, we had just saw this in the previous stream too, so The first fund was raised in 2014. Okay, that's a year before this. And this is the China Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. SIA. Asked for tax cuts and reduced regulation, but in 2014, the Chinese government approved 20 billion in, so around 20 billion in subsidies fund its domestic semiconductor manufacturing business through the China Integrated Circuits Industry Investments Fund. So I think this was right for US based companies like Intel, AMD, Micron, because they were scared that Chinese-based companies would overtake them and gain more market share. Okay. So I think that's kind of the analysis here. So this is also interesting because situation was complex because China was a crucial market. Pretty much every US semiconductor firm semiconductors were sold to Chinese customers. Semiconductors were used to assemble electronic devices in China. So this is phones, maybe computers, household items. Faced. So US companies Oops. Yeah, okay, so this is interesting. I guess to summarize what we're thinking about here, or what Chris is thinking about, basically, 2014, there was this landmark legislation being passed by the Chinese government to approve $20 billion in subsidies to fund its domestic semiconductor manufacturing business through something called the China Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. And from the perspective of US based companies that produce semiconductors or design semiconductors like Intel, AMD, and Micron, these guys were sort of in some type of bind because one, the Chinese market was super important for them in terms of a business opportunity because they sold directly to Chinese customers, Chinese end markets. So these could be companies like Huawei, Vivo, Oppo. These guys are the telecommunications and hardware giants in China at that time, and they used a lot of the US-based semiconductors in order to build their products. And then you also have a lot of US-based companies like Apple. They ended up having a lot of factories in China. So they have to ship all of these semiconductors, probably from Taiwan if they're made by TSMC, to mainland China where the final end product gets assembled. So there's a lot of activity going on in China. I guess that's the best way to put it. And it's an important part of these US-based chip makers. But what's happening here is the Chinese government is basically saying, we're going to try to screw you. And in order to do that, we're going to spend $20 billion to screw you guys over so that our companies are going to pretty much be able to dominate this entire Chinese market. So that's kind of where I think we're at right now. Chinese government. Like, we are going to spend 20 billion to screw over the US-based companies. $250 billion fund? Okay, maybe I missed something here. Oh, Tsinghua Unigroup. Right, right. Totally forgot about that. Okay, so I'm gonna come back real quick. Gonna try to clean my glasses. Keep slipping down. Apparently, government subsidies to support specific industries is considered an unfair trade practice. So let's see. Is government subsidy on industry a bad for international trade? Unfair for Okay, so yeah, this is an interesting article of, let's see, Turner. Esoteric life philosophy and business. Okay, interesting. Alright, I'm gonna put this here though. So, Wikipedia article on government subsidies Okay. So Penny Pritzker. Penny Pritzker. Yeah, Secretary of Commerce. Oh, that's interesting. So yeah, that's kind of crazy. All of these guys are billionaires. All right, well, that's actually kind of interesting. I'm glad I was able to get into this. So Penny Pritzker is an American billionaire heiress and former Commerce Secretary during the Obama administration. So I think this is from 2012 to 2016, right? 2013. Wait a minute. Her family owns a large portion of Hyatt hotels. Dad, Donald Pritzker, was the founder of Hyatt Hotels. Okay, I mean, she does seem pretty accomplished, if I must say so. Wow. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna copy this. It's cool. Okay, so Penny Pritzker. So let's see. Maybe add this. I wonder if I could turn this into a list. Okay. She made a speech for Obama office saying that China would be the biggest competitor in the semiconductor industry moving forward. They have to ever needs to get done in order to come to leapfrog the US. Good, so Chris is saying here that the laissez-faire approach that the US had on the chip industry really allowed their dominance to slip. A lot of Asian countries, I think Taiwan is probably the biggest one here, they had a lot of government support in bolstering the domestic semiconductor process and the industry, so maybe the manufacturing industry, and then I think also maybe lithography as well. So lithography was mainly done by the Netherlands. Yeah. Okay, so I think this is also maybe an interesting thing. So Chris Miller talks. Claims that many people in DC, congressmen, maybe semiconductors proclaimed the ideas of globalization, claimed the massive benefits of globalization. So I think globalization in their terms, in their eyes, was how should I say this? Building a global supply chain as opposed to a domestic one. But when it came to the semiconductor industry, it was more of a Taiwanization. U.S. government was relatively laissez-faire with its treatment of the semiconductor industry. Believing in free market forces, but Chris Miller says this only works if other countries also adopt the same laissez-faire model. Most countries in Asia did not, so the US fell behind. Okay, I think that's kind of the big idea here. Yeah. So you also have okay, so ZTE, what's this? ZTE and Huawei. You know, I'm surprised that this is also, that there's a stock price for this. Yeah. So the Obama administration considered imposing financial sanctions on ZTE. Selling to it. Okay, so what Chris Miller seems to be talking about here is that, how should I say this? The underlying administration, so we're talking about the presidential administration, maybe also the political party that they're affiliated with, they can have really big economic impacts on maybe they can have pretty big economic impacts on some of the they can have big economic impacts on the US. See real quick. Oh my god. Okay. Might go soon, and then maybe come back in a few more minutes. Let's see. Imposing financial sanctions on ZTE. Okay, so this is interesting. It was a state-backed telecommunications, so Chinese telecommunications company that was accused of violating sanctions in 2016 to North Korea and Iran. I wonder if you can find that article. So ZTE state, so that's probably in 2016, probably around here. Surprisingly enough, the stock price kind of rallied back then. So let's see, ZTE North Korea, Iran. So that's the 7th of March. Right, so it did fall a little bit, maybe. I'm surprised that, okay. And then somehow rallied. Okay, I guess, yeah, at that point, it's like, okay, this has been settled. Okay, so Obama administration considered imposing financial sanctions. CTE. So this would have closed off the company from the international banking system, receiving loans from non-Chinese banks. But I'd assume that probably wouldn't be a big deal, because if ZTE is state-backed, I'd assume that they have unlimited funding. States-owned corporation wouldn't have unlimited funding. Does it really need to borrow internationally, right? Maybe there's some currency risk that the company faces if it's only denominated in Chinese yen, but I'd assume it's probably not that big of a deal. Maybe that's not even a risk. Instead, the Obama administration decided to place export control on the company to prevent sale of U.S. equipment to ZTE. So before this was implemented, those ZTE signed a plea deal for and paid fine. Yeah. So ZTE, call this 2016 investigation. Ooh. New York Times. Okay, so this is where Huawei is mentioned too. Huh, so didn't realize that also happened. I see. Okay. So maybe it was part of the embargo deal. Not deal, but policy. Yeah, not entirely sure. So alright, I gotta go use the bathroom. I've been holding in this shit for a little bit, so I might do that. I'm gonna go use the bathroom, probably go shower, and maybe when I come back, I might work on first. Yeah, first I probably would want to work on my tech coverage stuff, and then I'll continue reading Chip War. So, yeah, with that, thanks for tuning in. Gonna go use the bathroom right now, and I'll catch you guys the next time.